So hi, and welcome to my podcast. I'm Naveen Vasudeva, in association with Cybertalks and sponsored by Barclays Bank. I'm here with Sarah Armstrong Smith, former head of Group Business Continuity and Crisis Management, currently an independent advisor in resilience and cybersecurity, and also a non-executive director of Cyber. We're going to be talking about all things resilience, I think, today, which is wonderful. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me. Before we start sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of all that kind of stuff, it would be really good for the audience if you could spend a few moments and maybe talk about a little bit about your career and where you've got to, the good and the bad, maybe. Let's go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I'd probably say I've been working in a technology environment for about 20 odd years, but I've come in a little bit left field. So I don't come from a traditional cybersecurity background. So if I roll the clock back to beginning of 1999, all that long ago, I was actually working for a utility company and I was working on the year 2000 programme. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's what really launched my career. And as I say, I started from a business continuity perspective, really asking the difficult questions about what was really going to happen on the stroke of midnight, how are we going to keep operations together, not just looking at it purely from an IT perspective. And then from there I joined AXA. And at the time, AXA had been going through a number of mergers and acquisitions, and they ended up with lots of different IT departments, and they were going through a server consolidation transformation program. And I started working on disaster recovery, so doing lots of testing. But that just happened to coincide with 9/11 as well. So I'd only been working there a couple of months, and that really kick-started off the need for replication. So historically, a lot of the DR testing and things like that, recovery was based on a sort of 72-hour window of backup tapes. And and I just really liked getting into the technology side. I then worked for Ernst & Young for a couple of years, and I worked in the technology risk services area. And it was my first go at being a consultant. And I got to see the good, the bad, and let's say the ugly. I won't name names. But I was a mixture of assurance and advisory. So with my assurance hat on, I would be working as an auditor. And let's just say people like to divulge their dirty laundry. So that was a really good insight for me. But I think I didn't want to just be pointing out areas where things were wrong, lots of reds and ambers. And then I joined Fujitsu. So I spent 12 years at Fujitsu in a cybersecurity division. I then became the head of continuity and resilience, led a team of consultants. And they were specialising, again, sort of business continuity, disaster recovery, cyber, data protection and privacy. And then I went on to the London Stock Exchange where I was for 6 months. So group head of business continuity and crisis management. How I always describe myself is I always sort of say I'm on the business side of cyber. And what I mean by that is a lot of my colleagues at Fujitsu so just have a big security operations centre, very, very technical, very focused on the technical aspects of cyber, servers, infrastructure and that kind of thing. But because of my business continuity background, I was always there to ask the why. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to protect? What's the impact when things go wrong? And so I'd almost kind of come in at the front end and almost kind of justify the business requirement, the business case for cyber, the legitimising the tools and all those type of things. And then I would sort of say then I'd come in at the back end, potentially when things go wrong, if there's a cyber attack, data breach, I think it's not just about having a cyber incident response. How does that dovetail with a much wider incident response crisis management?
Sure.
So that's kind of how my career has grown across all those 20 odd years.
So how have you found, that's a really exciting and varied career in both sort of consultancy, sort of supplier world and sort of the commercial space. What has been your sort of high points and low points between those organisations, would you say?
It's difficult. I always kind of liken my career to a game of snakes and ladders, really. It's a bit of a taking a chance, bit of a gamble. And I've always been sort of one of these people who's challenged the status quo, whether they like to be challenged or not. So it's dependent on how well received sometimes and how willing people are to make a change. And
do you find that organisations are not really agile enough to deal with people that think outside the box?
I think so, and I think there's a little bit of silos in some sectors, dare I say. And I think it's you kind of get that this is the way it's always been. It's very, very traditional, those type of things. And actually, when you've got the benefit of looking across different sectors,
yep.
And I think that was probably one of the best things from my perspective, is I've worked across central government, financial services, utilities, energy, and I see the best of all of those, and potentially the worst of all of them as well. But I like to see, well, what can we take, what can we learn from each of those things, and kind of collaborate and pull all those things together. And I think that's where I see the real benefit is actually, as I say, taking all those lessons learned and sort of say, well, how can we collectively kind of move forward, and really kind of like work together to the best effort, really.
Sure. I mean, that sounds pretty amazing. So in terms of your focus now in looking at sort of that broader picture in resilience, so you recently presented at Scott Secure,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Around some of the ABCs of resilience. Maybe you could share some of
yeah, so it's quite interesting. So I was actually asked to join by the conference based on feedback they'd had from the previous year.
Right.
And it was from the delegates, and they sort of said, actually, we really want to know more about incident response and crisis management, particularly from a cyber perspective. And I think, although I've worked in lots of different fields, crossing across all of those has been crisis management. And really where I was coming from is things that you should do and things you shouldn't do. So I was always talking about the ABC don'ts of crisis management. And I think there's some, we're very much in that sort of environment now where it's a case of when, not if. So it's very highly likely you are going to get attacked at some point. You've probably already been breached, and it's a case of, do you know it, don't you know it? And I think it's not about the incident, it's about how you handle it.
Sure.
And I think that is really the key point. So I kind of look at some of the don'ts, and some of that was right, don't deny you've had a problem, don't lie about it, because we've got things like social media. Things have a habit of getting out, whether you like it or not, and it will come back to bite you on the arse ultimately. So the quicker you can get out there, the quicker you can communicate, and I think it's all about being open and transparent. So people aren't expecting you to be whiter than white, not have problems. People have problems, right? But as I say, it's the way you handle it and the way you deal with it. And then I just conversely sort of then, well, what do you do? So I just very quickly, so I was going for the A, B's and C's. So one of the A's was being accountable. So, whatever's happening, whatever's going on, own up, be accountable, and take decisive action. The second, the B, if you like, was about being blameless. So I think it's very easy, we get into that kind of habit of blaming the users. They're the ones who clicked the link, they're the ones who did a mass dump of on email or whatever the case may be. But actually, it's not the people that are the problem, it's not the technology the problem, it's the process that's the problem. And it's about us waking up to the fact that actually when things go wrong, it's not about pointing fingers, it's about, well, what do we need to do to improve things? And I would just sort of say on the C is all about communication and communicating to multiple different stakeholders. And it's really about controlling that narrative. And I think one of the key areas that people forget about is actually communicating to their employees. So they're told the outside world, what's going on and what they're doing about it, but they haven't actually told their own people. So actually, when we talk about helping them to be the strongest link, that's how we can use our employees to actually help us get the messages out there and reinforce what we want to kind of get out. And it's all about brand protection at the end of the day.
So around, I really like the concept around the ABCs. I think it's a quite an easy, digestible thing for people to understand. So. Pulling it back a little bit then, do you find that the initial accountability that an organisation needs to take is sometimes lost? And putting that into context is them as an organisation or individuals within an organisation not really accepting the fact that they have a problem, don't want to admit that they have a problem, And going back to the blame, the B, it's somebody else's issue, or it's the IT departments to fix, or the security departments to fix, or somebody else. And they feel that they've done a sufficient amount of education. So have you come across that kind of mindset? And what is the precursor to help them change it?
I think a lot of it is a culture. Unfortunately, I think it's very much about, if you have a very open, transparent, when you've got a problem, you call it out culture. I think that level of accountability and owning up to things is a lot more easier. If you come from a culture which is one of those where, let's just put it under the carpet, hope no one will notice. When things go wrong, people are too scared to talk about it, to own up. And what happens, it ends up going underground. And actually, one of the things I talk about from an incident response perspective is things don't just happen by chance.
Sure.
Normally there's a trigger of events that have led up to it. Potentially you've had early warning systems or signs. So you might have had audits, you might have had reports that things were quite right as they should have been. You might have had some reds and ambers. And over time, if they keep getting ignored, and we all know about patching vulnerabilities and what happens when things are end of life and things are out of support, and it just extrapolates.
Cyclical in
yeah, exactly.
Respect.
And the problem is the more that goes on, the more it becomes normalised, and that's where we get, as I said at the beginning, this is the way it's always been. There's no challenge then to actually be better.
Do you think then, at an executive level, sometimes people are quite immune to then hearing, actually, we have a problem?
I think so.
And in the back of their minds, they may be thinking, well, actually, we haven't seen anything materialise that you're talking about, and therefore, don't worry about it. Up until the point where it becomes a public issue, and they are now in crisis and have to manage something.
I think a lot of it, what I've seen, particularly when things are what gets reported up to an executive level, and dare I say, it's almost a case of, let's report what they want to hear. So, the people, let's say, on the ground maybe do understand some of the issues, some of the problems, but as it gets reported up further up the food chain, potentially it kind of gets a bit washed down, distilled.
Yeah.
Because, they want to paint a picture of things are working well, we're doing the right things, and I think, I think actually where we make the most positive impact is being able to feel like we can actually have those conversations with our leadership team to actually say, point out there are risks. And these risks potentially have been there for a long time. But I think it's being able to articulate the so what. I talk about the so what and what if. They're two really simple questions. But a so what is being able to really articulate the risk and the impact of that, which is where that kind of so what comes in. And I think sometimes people get into this kind of stating the obvious. If our IT system, if our IT systems fail, we're not going to be able to access to our, technology and what have you. But yeah, right, that's the obvious bit, right? But what's the actual impact?
Yeah.
What's the impact to our employees? What's the impact to our customers and their customers, and to regulators and all of these? So I think once you can kind of portray the big picture and actually put it into a language that people can understand. So we need to move it away from being just about technology and technology risks, and actually, as I say, just put it into a language where people can comprehend what it is you're talking about, what the impact is, and therefore what you're going to do about it. And I think, once we can get into that mindset, I think it's going to be a lot easier for us to kind of point out where these risks are.
So with changing trends in technology now, with a lot of organisations looking at distributed networks, cloud capabilities, both at an infrastructure and an application level, with less, I would say, onus on retained, architecture. So making those organisations much more agile. Do you think that then changes the resiliency question that you're talking about, or actually does it put more onus on resilience because you're not really in control of the services that you're now running?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that the really great thing is about a lot of the innovation and moving to cloud is actually improving resilience to a certain extent. And I think the environment that we're working on, where we're in this kind of always on demand, so people don't accept downtime, in essence. So we know, if your bank's down for 5 minutes, and even if they'll say, I'm doing routine maintenance at 3 a.m, someone's going to be complaining. So we're in this kind of unfortunately always on demand.
Yeah.
But that inadvertently then improves the resilience, because it means your recovery has to be quicker. You have to test all of those things continuously. But I think as well is, from that kind of accountability thing again, is just because you might use some on-prem, you might have some cloud, you probably have some software as a service, you have things distributed all over the place, but you can't just throw it over the fence and see where it lands and just kind of think, well, Mr. Vendor, you host support that for us, so it's your problem.
Right.
You still have to have the accountability and the right governance and the right policies and processes in place. So I think it's getting that right, but I think it's so important, therefore, to really understand that we've moved away from almost having a level of control where you could have said everything was nice and neat in my data center, and now it's potentially here, there, and everywhere. So I think that's the challenge: is actually, where's my data, and who's got access to it, and what happens when it goes wrong. And it does come back to that sharing and collaboration again, I think, and actually having the grown-up conversations with the vendors to kind of understand, what do I get, what I don't get, and it's not a magic wand. I think people fall into a trap sometimes of thinking if I buy more tools, the tools are going to fix all my problems, but tools will only go so far.
But I also think there's a potential lack of to your point, communication about what requirements need to be set in the first instance.
Exactly.
So some of the failings that I've come across in organisations is the security or recovery, resilience, disaster recovery teams not actually stipulating correctly to a supplier or vendor in terms of service and contract levels and SLAs, and they make huge assumptions.
Yeah.
And then suddenly when they're in trouble, their expectation is on the service provider to support them, and they're not actually contractually obliged to. So there is a bit of an education gap, I think, between the supplier and the individuals running services internally. How have you managed part of that challenge, because it's not an easy one to fix?
No, so I can sort of liken it to Fujitsu. So we used to, Fujitsu would sometimes have big managed services contracts, and some of those would be fully outsourced, and you'd be hosting and managing all of the infrastructure, and that would come with an element of disaster recovery, security, etc. Most of the time, those requirements have either come directly from the IT department or from procurement. And you were saying exactly that. You spend a lot of time and effort putting in all these solutions, designing what you think is right, because that's what the IT team thought was right, what procurement thought was right. But actually, when you find out, it doesn't resemble what the business is doing, or it might have resembled what the business needed X years ago. Yeah. But actually, things are changing at such a rapid pace. But if we're on this kind of, takes us 18 months to transform and put in all these solutions, 18 months later we find it doesn't reflect what the business need. So I actually found and part of what my team are doing is really about getting closer to the business. So actually we're not just talking to IT, it's getting as closer into the business as possible. And actually in a roundabout way, when GDPR came in, that was a really good opportunity for us to actually have those conversations, and it really about the data and take it away from about being infrastructure. It's not about how many servers you need, what's the level of storage do you want, blah blah blah. It was about, well, if we know what the data needs and the access requirements, and there's any regulatory controls and all of these type of things, then actually the solution is built out the back end of understanding the requirement, as opposed to just building the infrastructure and then thinking, well, what applications are going to go on this? Where's the data going to go? And I think the problem is you end up having to re-architect a lot of the back end, because it wasn't designed for the data, for the users, and how all these things are going to get used. I'm
still quite surprised about the lack of secure by design in a lot of organisations, right? And to your point about GDPR, privacy by design, integrated into that. But a lot of the breaches we're seeing as poorly designed services in the first instance, poorly configured infrastructure, poorly configured and developed applications and services, and so on and so forth.
And I think, just to come to that as well, I think with my service provider hat on, it's almost kind of like this, people get a little bit confused about what you get as standard. So they just assume my supplier, my vendor is going to give me all of these things, so I don't need to ask for it. But actually you do need to be really explicit in terms of what you want, what you don't want. And let's be grown up. There's a cost attached to some of these things. So, if you want the bells and whistles, then it's more expensive. But conversely, at the opposite end, if you just go for the cheapest solution, then when something goes wrong, you're not going to have the things recovered and the right levels of security and everything else. So it's really important to really try to think about where we're going to invest all our time and effort. And what I've seen historically is people try and put a thin layer of security on everything, and it just leaves gaps and vulnerabilities on everything. So if you can get to understand the real core of what's critical and why, I can put my investment in time and effort into that, as opposed to just putting a bit on everything and hoping for the best. And I think that's where we've got to be able to have that understanding, but also I think we need a much closer, more collaborative relationship with our vendors as well.
And I totally agree. I think there is a huge disparity between security, resiliency, supplier and vendor relationships at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's something that we've talked about, prior to this session, very much about how do we bridge that gap, right? What's the right mix of individuals to be able to create collaborative conversations about how to solve problems, because actually we can't fix them in isolation.
Yeah, exactly that.
So some of the additional challenges I've seen around process, I don't mind if you could share some of your knowledge around what good and bad incident management processes are, because I think still we're seeing a lot of failure internally around processes where things don't get captured, reported, assigned correctly, and then you're sort of returning back to your ABCs. A lot of blame then gets put on to various teams for not being able to communicate out or in as to what happened. So anything you can share around that space would be really useful.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always talk about is learning lessons, and that can be learning lessons from previous incidents. As I sort of say, most major incidents have been a catalyst of things that have occurred before.
Sure.
So, there might have been smaller incidents. There might have been, as I was sort of saying, there's lots of risk reports and gaps with regards to things being end of life, not being patched properly, things being out of support, and all of these things that are building up. So I think it's part of that is from where we've had near misses, to actually classify it as a near miss, but don't kind of just go, phew, God, move on. So I think actually when you delve into a lot of these things, you can start actually unpicking where the issues are. So you can just turn around, and if you just stop at the first hurdle and say, well, the server crashed. I said, it didn't just crash. Servers don't just crash by themselves. Actually wind it backwards. There's probably a change request that went wrong, or somewhere further down in the process the access controls weren't right. You can unpick a lot of these things, and actually when you start looking at some of these things, you can start to improve those processes, as opposed to just, weren't we lucky, the incident wasn't as bad as it could have been, until it is. I know if you're only going to react when it's really hit the fan, you've lost so many opportunities to fix them before.
So have you gone down a path where you're looking at both the qualitative result of an near miss and the quantitative result of a near miss, so actually assigning a monetary value to that near miss?
I think it's hard, I think, to actually be able to put sometimes a value onto something, but I think where we're sort of seeing is it's more about the reputation risk, we were talking about the wider repercussions. So how does that impact your customers and their customers, and what kind of industry are you in? So if you're working in a public sector and you've got life and safety risks, that obviously that's a lot easier to comprehend than some different areas. But I think it's about being able to articulate that so what. In its wider repercussions. But also what I find quite interesting, again, about these lessons learned, is people don't look at companies who've had similar incidents. They'll just kind of go, oh well, thank God that wasn't me, but actually it could have been you. No one's immune, as we said, to having a breach or an attack or things going wrong. But actually I think that's where we can kind of go, okay, well, let's actually have a good look at what happened in that sector, what's going on over here, what can we learn from all of these things. But I think another part of it as well is you can't just wing it. You can't just say, well, let's just wait till we've had an incident and then figure it out. So you do have to have kind of a plan. You have to have an escalation process. You need to know what those escalation triggers are, and make sure you're talking to the right people at the right time.
Yeah.
And obviously testing that whole response as well. So I think a lot of people don't do enough of that. And stress testing some of those things. What is your worst case scenario? But most people don't go anywhere near the worst case. They just deal with what's easy in front of them. So actually, when the worst thing does happen, it's a little bit like headless chicken mode.
Yeah.
But actually, it doesn't matter what type of incident you've had. Actually, the process should be the same, no matter what, because there's no two incidents are the same, right? So you could, even if you turn around and said, multiple companies have had a cyber attack, data breach, but actually the triggers and how what happened and when and whatever are all different. But actually, the process should be the same.
So do you think there's an insufficient amount of intelligence sharing when it comes to incidents in the commercial space, but also probably in the private sector, the public sector?
I do, but I think it's getting better. So I think people didn't want to admit they'd had a problem. They didn't want to admit it. If they admit they've had a breach or anything else, it shows a sign of weakness. But actually, again, this is where the GDPR helped, because it kind of forced people into that you must report within 72 hours. And I found what was quite interesting is within the first sort of 3 months when GDPR, there was a massive spike in the amount of notifications that were going to the ICO, amount of complaints. That doesn't mean there was suddenly a massive spike in cyber attacks or data breaches. It meant that people were actually getting into that mindset of actually being accountable, actually reporting it, actually doing all of these things. So actually the true extent of the risk probably wasn't known before, because so much of it was not in the public domain. But I think if we go back to that point where we said it's a case of when, not if, you are going to be attacked.
Sure.
Right? So it's a different mindset, because a lot of risk is about something may happen. So if we start thinking about it will happen, and it's just a case of, is it going to be today? Is it tomorrow? Actually, it could have already happened, you didn't know about it.
And most of it's opportunistic, right? You know, unless you're targeted, where it's organised crime, it's slightly different. But if you're a large institution, the likelihood is, somebody is going to want to have a poke at your organisation.
But even sort of saying that, even if, you are targeted, you should have the threat intelligence. You should know that you're a high value target, so, and that there are potentially, organisations or, you've got organised crime, state-sponsored attacks, whatever you want to look at it, and they are going to try and cause as much disruption as possible, no matter how they do it. But so actually, you need to be proactive. You need to be thinking about that kind of that. And again, I'll come around to that what if. How far can it go, and what's the impact? So I think just kind of. There's and like I say, there's a lot to be said about actually bringing lots of different sectors together, because I think people are still in their silos. So you'll have financial services look at financial services, you'll have energy just looking at energy, but actually in terms of we're all in the same boat. I always look at it as you break it down to its common denominator. All companies are by and large the same. So you've all got people, you've all got buildings, you've all got technology, you've all got suppliers. The only thing that sets you apart is what it is you do, what's your sell, what's your product, what your service is. But if you break it down to that lower level, then you can kind of understand that actually we're all in it together.
Yeah.
And then,
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and ultimately there's no point being last man standing, right? How does that benefit anybody?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned one really interesting point about companies showing weakness if they admitted to being breached or, having processes that may not be adequate, both from a customer and an employee point of view. Isn't it a little bit more, actually they're probably worried about the litigation that will follow, and actually admitting to something that they've known over a period of time could cause more damage to their reputation and their brand and everything that they stand for. So therefore, this kind of covering it under the rug is more common than we think it is.
I think there is a little bit of that, and I think there's that sort of cultural thing. And I think it does come back to don't admit liability because you'll get sued because of the repercussions. But actually, I think that's sending out the wrong messages. It's not about us. it's about our customers.
Yeah.
And they're, as I say, they're customers. So if we're looking at it from our perspective, if we're looking at saying, I'm only concerned about if someone's going to try and sue me, and I'm not thinking about those wider things, my mindset's in the wrong place to start with. So I'm not in a sharing mode. I'm about protecting me mode. And I think that's where it's seeing that switch. Is actually, I think when you see those companies who are looking at it from a different lens, they start acting different and thinking different. And you can't get away from some, you're probably, you're going to piss someone off at some point, right? And no matter what you do, someone is going to be,
upset.
Yeah. But I think you need to be able to show that you did the right things for the right reasons and why you took the actions that you did. But ultimately, if you can come out as quickly as possible and do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, is anyone going to really argue with you?
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about pandemic planning.
Okay.
It's on the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment with what's going on in the world. I remember it from SARS, back in the early 2000s and the chaos that caused. What's your kind of take on what's happening in that space, and how prepared are we as a country? Be very interested in your take as that, but also just generally from a business point of view, if this does eventually be classified as a pandemic, then what's the next step for organisations in that crisis management space?
Exactly. So, I always sort of say is really what we should be planning for is not the cause of an incident, the effect of an incident, because the causes are always going to be different. So I was always saying, you're looking at what's the impact if you lose a building, what's the impact if you lose your IT, what's the impact if you lose a supplier, what's the impact if you lose your people. So we're in that people side of things. But I think, again, if I liken it back to the start of the coronavirus and I think about the way it was handled, there was a lot of denial, let's say, coming from the government, Chinese government. There was a lot of deflection. So actually it's not as bad. It's not as bad as SARS. It's not as bad as this. It's not as bad as that. And actually, it took a long time for those messages to get out. And by that point, it was almost kind of too late. You lost the opportunity to really get a hold of it and get a grip of it early on. So you're no longer in that kind of position of isolation and what have you. But I think what doesn't help is the media sensationalising everything. So I think a lot of people are going to panic mode. They start thinking about, how's this going to impact me? How's this going to impact all of these different things? I think that's one issue is, making sure we're factual and not trying to sensationalise things, trying to be objective, but also we can plan to a certain extent, but some things are outside of our control. So once the government starts imposing various different things, but I think what's quite interesting is if you look at just what's going on in China alone, let alone what's going on across the rest of the world, they didn't accept help when it was offered to them. So they tried to confine it, and as we now know, that confining something, don't owning up to something, having that level of accountability, this causes problems. But I think once they had to start isolating, and then you had borders being closed, and you had airlines not moving in. Now we've got one of the biggest superpowers in the world who are potentially on their knees. Who would have thought an incident of that size has a ripple effect? And it's not necessarily about just the people. It's actually what's the impact if you can't get people to work, if your suppliers can't deliver you services, and all of these things together. So I think it's people kind of can sit in their glass houses and go, well, that's over in Asia, that's not my problem. But as we know, everything is connected in one way or another. So much production, so much manufacturing is done from China, and we're seeing it's not the impact right now. It's not necessarily on the people side, although that is still a risk. It's not getting goods and services from China, which is having that impact
in the current state of global markets.
Exactly, and I think the markets are so volatile. They're reacting to what's going on all over the world. So although we can turn around and say, selfishly, let's say from a UK perspective, although there's been cases, thankfully we haven't had anyone who's died yet, but we're now seeing people in Europe, Italy, for example, they're starting to see that spread of the virus. So I think it's not just looking at purely from a pandemic being a people risk. Actually, It touches on everything. And I think this is where we come back to what is the worst case scenario. So I remember, I was working on the H1N1, so swine flu, back in 2009, and that was arguably the last big pandemic that we had. And it was, from my perspective, being a service provider, it was always about we will carry on providing services until we can't. And that was the stance that we took. Now, what was quite interesting was I was working on a global account, and one of the service desks was actually in Malaysia, and the local government took the decision to just shut the entire building down to the first case of swine flu. So I think you can plan to a certain extent within a company and within the confines of what you can realistically do, but you also have to be mindful that some things are going to be outside of your control.
Yeah.
And I think more importantly, it does really, in a roundabout way, it kind of brings the technology full circle, because actually, do you have the ability to remote work? Do you have the technology? Do you have the services available to you? And if we are in that situation where people are being isolated and they can't go to where they need to be, then you're more dependent on cloud, you're more dependent on internet, you're more dependent on all of these things. And actually, you want to be stress testing now, not just waiting until however many months down the road when all of these things start getting imposed, and then finding actually we don't have enough concurrent usage, we don't have these facilities, we don't have supplies. So actually, the more work we can do early on, the better, I'd say.
So and actually a good way of summarising some of that is, rather than building contingency on contingency on contingency, you're building the resilience in the first place to be able to make sure that your organisation to a certain degree can operate, but actually there may be a point in time where you have to accept that you may not be able to, because of things like governments taking a stance on on something that's just beyond your control.
Yeah, and to come back to your point before, when people were talking about being scared of litigation and things like that, that's where this whole thing from force majeure comes in. So you kind of have a level of protection, in terms of stopping that from happening, that you can't provide a service. It doesn't necessarily automatically mean, right, well, I'm going to sue you then, because everybody's kind of in a similar boat. But I think it's understanding how bad can it get, and where's it coming from. So I think, as you were saying quite rightly, we are in that being proactive and actually questioning, our whole supply chain, and are we overly dependent on certain areas, certain companies? And I think when I remember another incident, which was, I don't remember what year it was specifically, but there was probably about 10 years ago, there was a massive floods in Thailand, and there was a world shortage on hard drives. And that was because, although companies were buying from different suppliers, actually the end point manufacturer, there was only about 3 who made them in the world. and that had the ripple effect, so a flood on the other side of the world has caused a hard drive impact elsewhere. So it's just understanding that, you think that you've got separate supplies from different resources, but are you sort of checking how far back that goes, and do all roads lead to the same point? And how you managing that risk.
What's happening with the CPU processors in China at the moment? So there's a lack of CPU processors being.
And that's what I was saying is, how much manufacturing over the years has been derived from China. So you then start to sort of see that ripple effect is, when you start looking at moving all your processing or manufacturing to China, we offshore our call centres to India, for example, and do we actually have the ability to switch services to different points of the world? I mean, obviously not everyone's working to a global organisation, but we should be able to kind of say, can I switch? How easy is the switch? Or am I literally a sitting duck in the water? In which case, that worst case scenario can be coming quicker for some companies than others.
True.
I think.
So what do you see as the the forthcoming challenge in convincing organisations that actually resilience or risk around resilience is something that needs to be taken seriously. So with cybersecurity as a whole, the challenge is not just convincing your C-suite, it's convincing your board, it's convincing your investors that you need to be able to adequately invest in, people, process and tech. And that equation is becoming harder and harder to sell in a lot of organisations. So what's your sort of vision towards the future and in the way that we can best tackle that problem? But also in terms of how do we simplify it? Because I'm just reflecting on this conversation as a whole, and though it may make absolute sense to you and I think there's still an educational gap. So how do we simplify it for a very non-technical individual, a CEO that potentially isn't focused on that, they're just focused on delivering their business?
Well, I think it's what makes you the differentiator. So I think a lot of this all comes down to trust, being a responsible business. So we shouldn't be in an environment where we're having to convince our board to invest in security and resilience and all of these type of things. Unfortunately, say for some, it's still a challenge. It's an ongoing battle. But I think it does really come down to the difference between needing to do something and wanting to do something. So I think if you come from a position of wanting to make a difference, wanting to be a responsible business, wanting to be the differentiator, you're automatically coming at it from a different perspective.
Sure.
So I always think about it, if you're coming from it because my regulator is telling me to do it, or my contract's saying, what's the bare minimum I can get away with, you're coming from it from a different perspective. So it's about changing the mindset, I think. And where does that opportunity lie? So because we're in as we know, we're in a really competitive environment. So what makes your company stand out above everyone else? I do think that actually the differentiator in some of these things is what's going to tip the balance ultimately.
I mean, having spent 26 plus years in this industry, I've seen, like you, the good and the bad, and organisationally, cost is a major driver in everything you do. But demonstrating actual factual risk versus perceived is also very difficult, and whether that's security or resiliency. I think a lot of organisations are still waiting for something to happen, and then are in that reactive mode rather than what you've been talking about today, which is the proactive side of things.
I think it's hard, because you're basically talking about changing a whole culture of an organisation. That's not an easy thing to do, particularly for some of these bigger institutions. But I do feel like this, what we're seeing now, is security being a board level topic. And we're having sort of heads of security and risk being able to have those top level conversations. So I think it will change over time, but it's something that still needs investment. It needs things like this. It needs that education, needs a collaboration, and I think people just what I see, and especially when I'm talking to people, is that people are getting more into that sort of mindset of opening up, being a bit honest, being a bit vulnerable, and actually kind of admitting, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I don't have all the answers. You're not expected to have all the answers, and by actually having that little bit of vulnerability, having that little bit of, actually I need help, there's loads of help we can get out there, and being able to lean on our vendors and our suppliers and to some extent even our competitors, because as I say, we're all in the same boat, and actually there's a lot we can gauge from each other. And
I think that's something that's probably lacking at the moment within both the resiliency and the cybersecurity community is effective knowledge sharing, but also talking about leaning on others. We talk about Chatham House rules and we get into a room, but we're not actually really talking about solving a problem. We're just generalising about a problem, which we all know we have. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a shame. So I would like to see that kind of change, that whole mentality around. Actually, if we come at it as a collective, we're probably going to have a better chance of preventative measures than sort of these reactive things.
Yeah, exactly that.
So what's next for you then, in terms of your next steps?
Yeah, so I think for me, I love working in technology, but I think one of the things I'm really fascinated on is the emerging tech and innovative tech. And I think we talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, autonomous systems. All of these things are coming, and that just makes our remit a whole much bigger.
Yes.
But also, and I think some of it is it's a race to the finish line with some of it, because there's not a lot of regulation out there, but that still means we're supposed to do the right thing. It's not just about putting our products out there, and leaving all these gaps and holes and everything else. So part of about where I'm interested in is exploring that whole bigger piece, and actually how is our role going to change going forward?
I think quite significantly, to be honest. Yeah. And there are a lot of unanswered questions around artificial intelligence, a lot of unanswered questions around machine learning and benefits or not. A lot of unanswered questions around medical devices and how we're going to govern those. And it's going to generate new regulation, new legislation. So I think it's a very exciting
I do, and I think even just if you looked at GDPR, I mean, just how long that took to come in. I think it was what's most heavily debated regulatory law in history, in EU history. It was like 3,000 iterations before it come in. And
we're no longer part of it.
But I think it just goes to show you, if you're waiting for the regulators or you're waiting for a law, it's already too late. So actually you need to be, it kind of comes back to doing the right thing. You don't need to be told how to do the right thing. You don't need to be told you need to be responsible. You don't need to be told how to do resilience and security by design and privacy by design. You should just be doing it.
I think the complication there around legislation and regulation is that to a certain degree there's an expectation that large institutions are self-regulating, and I think this is where they've created complexity, because if you go back 30 years where chemical companies and oil and gas organisations and energy firms, that they were all self-regulating. They were developing the technology at the time, and therefore the government really wasn't in tune with what they're doing.
Yeah.
I don't think cybersecurity is that different. If you think about private development of products and services versus what we see commercially, to the end user or to an institution, is it going to be Google or AWS? Who's going to get first with the quantum computer? But the challenge there is, once you've got the quantum computer, encryption technology, as we know, is done.
Exactly.
So where's quantum encryption?
So you're always playing catch up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, I am definitely a firm believer that we've got to almost kind of be grown up about what it is we're developing, what we're putting out there. But conversely, we've got to be accountable for the consequences. So if we put something out there which is potentially really harmful, not regulated, breaks every privacy rule, it's going to come back to bite us, right? Yeah. So I think the more that we can kind of go to, instead of we're not waiting around for someone to tell us what to do, we're just going to do the right thing. And I think if we can get more companies into that mindset, the better. I think it's a challenge, it's a massive challenge, because as you sort of saying, sometimes it is just a race to the finish line. Yeah. Who's going to get the most powerful out there, and then what's the consequences from everyone else, because then everyone else wants a bit,
So advice to any of our viewers that want to learn more about resiliency, or just personally interested in your journey and want some advice, so any last bits of advice that you would like to give our viewers?
I think it's one of those things. It's never too late to start, but you have to start. So if you don't have a plan, you have to create one. If you've had a plan but it's like 6 years old, dust it off and look at it. And it's not something you just update once a year. It's something that you do continuously. These threats and risks are coming all the time, and it's something we just need to do proactively. So I think, and there's lots of resources, lots of help. Come to me as well if you want some help in any of those areas. But I think the future's. We talk about the risk, right? Yeah. But I think there's so much potential as well.
It's bright.
It is. Let's leave it on that one. It's bright. It's exciting, and what a great place to have a career.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.